was dark out now, and it had to be past 8 p.m. There were a lot fewer trick-or-treaters now. We tried to go to certain blocks we hadn't gone down yet, which meant straying further away from Sean's house. We found a block we hadn't touched yet and continued knocking on doors. Some houses didn't answer at this hour, and mostly everyone else had a comment about us being alone, or how it was getting late. We noticed a man pushing a stroller a couple of houses down behind us. He was walking very slowly in our direction, probably a dad trick-or-treating for his young child. As we continued going door to door, the man with the stroller got closer. Eventually, we heard him going, "Shh," and singing softly. Eventually, he caught up to us and said, "How's the trick-or-treating going, boys?" We replied, "Good," at the same time. Then he said, "It's pretty late. I'm on my way back to my house. I can give you guys the rest of my candy." Sean and I looked at each other with telling faces as if we just hit the jackpot. Sean asked, "What kind of candies?" And he said, "A bunch of bags of different things." He said he didn't get to give much away because he wanted to take his daughter out for a trick-or-treat stroll. He did have a bag dangling on one of the handles of the stroller, which was filled with some candies. The stroller was fully covered by a folding piece on the top, so we couldn't see his daughter. He said she was asleep and he didn't want to wake her up, but he pointed ahead and said his house was just up this way, so we followed behind him as he pushed the stroller. He was walking a little faster now. As we walked, I realized there was next to no one else out at this point, even though it was a Friday night. It seemed like a quieter side of the neighborhood. The man talked to us as we walked, asking us questions. What part of the neighborhood we were from, where we went to school, basic stuff. I let Sean answer most of the questions. Him being even just a year older than me at that age, I felt like he was the one who should take the lead. On multiple occasions as we walked, the man would lean into the stroller and talk in a high pitch to his daughter. Then he'd turn back and smile at us. We finally made it to his house. He led us up the walkway with the stroller and unlocked his door. After he opened it, he brought the stroller with his daughter inside first, and then invited us to come inside. Sean led the way, so I followed. I was the one to ask if we could leave the door open, and the man paused, then said, "Yeah, of course." He said he'd be right back as he went to get the candy bags. He pushed the stroller into the middle of the living room, only about 10 feet away from where we were standing. I nudged Sean because I felt uncomfortable. I whispered, "Why would he leave the candy so far away?" Sean didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the living room and then walked up to the stroller. He lifted up the folding part that was covering the baby and he looked disturbed. He hurried back to me, whispering, "Let's go." He was full on running once we got outside, and I followed behind, which was a bit tougher because we had those heavy pillow sacks. I still was confused about what he saw, but just then we heard a woman's voice. "Y'all, excuse me." It was one of his neighbors. She came running over to us and asked if we knew that man, and it was at this point that Sean spilled the beans and said he offered us his leftover candy, but he was pushing a stroller with a fake baby in it. I remember getting goosebumps as he said that. The woman said, "Yeah, that man doesn't have a child. I saw you walking by with him." She took us to her car and drove each of us home. I know getting into a stranger's car after that was another questionable move. The woman came to my front door to talk to my mom about what we just told her. My mom was distraught after I told her every last detail about the night. She sent me to my room while my parents called the police on that man. My parents never told me anything about what happened after that. I believe they wanted to shelter me from any more exposure to the situation. My mom didn't want me going over to Sean's house anymore, and I know she had quite a bit to say to Sean's mom. I did see Sean at school once in a while still, and we remained cordial, but our friendship was never the same after that. Halloween had always been my favorite time of year, especially now that I had a daughter, Lily, who was old enough to really enjoy it. She was 6 and she'd been talking about her costume for weeks. A princess, of course. I'd taken her trick-or-treating every year since she could walk, and each year we'd come home and sort through her candy together, laughing about the weird costumes and spooky decorations we'd seen. It was a tradition, something simple and fun. But this year would be different. We got home that night, Lily exhausted but still giddy, clutching her overflowing candy bag. My wife was out of town for work, so it was just the two of us. After getting her into her pajamas, I set her up on the couch with a movie, and I started my usual routine, checking her candy, piece by piece. It was something I'd always done, not because I ever expected anything to be wrong, but because, as a parent, you just want to be sure. At first, everything looked fine. Mini chocolate bars, lollipops, the usual. But then I pulled out a small bag of gummy bears, and something made me pause. The packaging looked off. It wasn't torn exactly, but there was a small puncture near the top, as if someone had poked it with a needle. I frowned, set it aside, and kept going. Then I found another. A chocolate bar, slightly crumpled, with a tiny hole in the wrapper. I pressed on the candy inside and noticed it felt softer than it should have, like it had been tampered with. My heart started to race a bit, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe it got crushed in her bag, or maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I found a third. A small piece of hard candy, the kind that usually comes in a clear wrapper. This one had been unwrapped and poorly rewrapped, as if someone had taken it out and hastily tried to cover it up again. My gut told me something was seriously wrong. 3 pieces of candy, all from different types of packaging, and all with signs of tampering? It couldn't be a coincidence. I looked over at Lily, her eyes half closed as she watched the movie, oblivious to the fact that something sinister might be lurking in her candy bag. I carefully put the suspicious candy aside and started thinking. Where had we gotten these? We'd hit a dozen or so houses, all in the neighborhood. It had been the usual crowd, families, older folks handing out candy, even the new couple who'd just moved in a few months ago. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. But then I remembered something. There was one house a little further down the street toward the cul-de-sac that we almost hadn't gone to. The lights were off and it didn't seem like anyone was home. But just as we were about to skip it, the door creaked open and Mr. Rourke, our neighbor, stepped out. He'd given Lily a handful of candy, smiled, and wished us a happy Halloween. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now, as I stared at the candy in front of me, a chill ran down my spine. I checked the wrappers again, and sure enough, all 3 pieces, the gummy bears, the chocolate, and the hard candy, had come from Mr. Rourke's house. My stomach dropped. Rourke wasn't just some random guy on the street. He was a family friend. We'd known him for years, even invited him over for dinner a few times. He was always friendly, always helpful, but now, I didn't know what to think. I grabbed my phone and called my wife, explaining what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "You need to take that to the police. Right now." I glanced over at Lily, who was now dozing off on the couch. "But it's Rourke, why would he?" "I don't know," my wife said, her voice strained. "But you can't take any chances. Not with Lily." I hung up and stared at the candy, my mind racing. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting, but then again, what if I wasn't? The next morning I went straight to the police station. I handed over the candy, explaining what I'd found. They took it seriously, more seriously than I'd expected. They told me they'd have it tested and that I'd done the right thing. Later that week, the test results came back. The candy had been laced with a sedative. Not enough to kill, but enough to knock a small child out. My heart sank when they told me. But what really made my blood run cold was what came next. The police had questioned Mr. Rourke. At first, he'd denied everything, but eventually, they found evidence. More tampered candy in his house, hidden in the back of a closet. When they dug deeper, they discovered something even more disturbing. He'd been keeping notes, detailed notes about Lily, her routine, her favorite toys, even what she liked to eat. It wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was targeted. And it wasn't just Lily. He'd been watching other kids in the neighborhood too. They arrested him that same day. I'll never forget the moment I realized how close we'd come to something far worse than a ruined Halloween. The fact that someone we knew, someone we trusted, could have hurt my daughter. It still haunts me. And now every year when Halloween rolls around, I check every single piece of candy. twice, because you never really know what kind of monsters are lurking behind the masks.